They left everything behind them. When they came to the border, they had nothing but the clothes on their backs, a cigar box full of family pictures, some dog-eared news clippings, a fierce work ethic, and a character that had been honed by suffering. There were two of them. One of them, the older one, was bent over from too many years of carrying too heavy a load. Her face looked out to the west, toward her once homeland, abandoned more than a decade earlier. The face that looked out was a hard face. It had been etched by acid, tears. It had a clenched jaw, narrow eyes. Such people suffer greatly. She was quiet, standing atop the mountain and seeing home again. Opened up a whole box of memories, more than I could tell you. Why, she saw the little house on the quiet street. She saw the little kitchen spread with groceries on the counter that would become their dinner. The dinner that would be served on her only inheritance from her father and mother, a round oak table with claw feet. In her memory, she got dinner together and left it cooking, got in the Volvo, the wagon with the soccer ball sticker on the back window, and she went to pick up her boys from practice. In her memory, she could still smell the sweet smell of the car's leather interior, and then the sour smell of sweaty boys. In her memory, her husband came home, as he always did, from his job, and their dinner was served on the heirloom table. Why, she could still see them. She could still hear them. She could even hear the symphony of forks clicking on plates when the blessing had been said. She could hear herself saying, "Don't talk with your mouth full. Keep your elbows off the table. Keep your hand and your napkin in your lap." All the things she said. And it all happened in a nanosecond. That's the way memory is. And then in the next second came that flood that always came, that washed all these beautiful things away, that made them fall like dominoes. First, her husband's job. And then the car. And then the house. Then the table sold on Craigslist. And then the food that had been on the table. What do you do when times are desperate? Well, we answer easily. You get another job. You step down. Sure, it's hard to step down, but you step down, you get another job, you live in a place nobody would really want to live, but then, you can deal with it. But there had been a famine. So you see, there were no more jobs to step down to, no car, no food. And then what do? Well, you beg and you borrow, you go to the church and you say, "Can we have a week in the hotel room?" Another day, and another day, and you do the best you can. There are a lot of people doing that. Until the day when she came home from begging, came into the cheap motel room and found her boys fighting over the only thing that was in the mini fridge, a half stick of rancid butter. And so she said to her husband, "I don't care what we do, but we've got to do something." So that night, under the cover of darkness, because they were embarrassed, so that no one would see their surrender, The 4 of them left town. And they headed toward a border that was a week's walk away. Another land. A border. Isn't that funny? A border. Why, it was a line on a map that somebody had drawn. When you got to the place, you didn't see a line in the dirt. But someone had drawn a border and said, that's your land, and this is my land. You stay in your land, and we'll stay in my land, and we'll get along. But as often happens, people who share a border become enemies. And the people across the border were bitter enemies. Why, they were racial enemies. The most bitter enemy. But you know what? When you're hungry, or worse, when your children have nothing to eat, well-defined lines that somebody drew on a map once, or a different color of skin than yours don't mean much to you, honestly. You do what you have to do. So they crossed the line on the map. They had heard there were jobs to be had there, and food. And you know what that did? It made them immigrants. They crossed the line. And that's trouble, always trouble. Because you know what everybody says about immigrants? You can sum them up with 5 Ds. Dirty, dangerous, devious, dumb, destructive. That's true, isn't it? It's what's always said about immigrants, by the way. It was said once about the Irish, about the Chinese, about the Africans. Why, it was even said once about us. That's what the Native Americans said about us. Dirty, dangerous, devious, dumb, and destructive of our world. But you know what? They came anyway, didn't they? Denied jobs that anybody might want. They took jobs that natives thought beneath their dignity, only to be accused of taking jobs that should belong to natives. For all their trouble, they were tormented by insults and mistreatment, but they worked anyway. And for these people who had become immigrants, the fruit of hard work came. It was real food, first of all. Real food. And then a table. And then a beater car. And then a trailer. And they were winning again. But they couldn't win because no one wanted to live near them. And yet the same people whispered that they were segregating themselves from everybody, not speaking the native language and not trying to fit in. They would never fit in. It was bad. What do you do? But you know what? No matter how bad it was, they could always look back behind them and remember it had been far worse. She got the job first as a domestic. You can get a job just about anywhere in the world if you are willing to be a domestic. And as barriers go, this one was broken down. The eyes that first watched her employer's eyes, watched her warily, could not help but be impressed by her work ethic, by her attitude, by her gratefulness for even a menial job, by her love for her family, by her deep faith in God. Her employer, after all, was a mother too. Maybe more than anything else, shared motherhood reaches across imaginary lines on a map and sees beneath different colored skin the same color of heart that's beating underneath. Thank God for mothers. Somehow, she graduated from domesticity to something else. Oh, it was the same work, but it was different. They smiled at each other. They shared with each other. They hugged each other. And this once employer gave her the merciful gift of being one person who saw her for who she really was and not for who everybody imagined her to be. They got on their feet, and they came to love the land where they were immigrants, even if the land did not love them back. A decade later, with jobs and a house and a table, they also now had 2 native daughters-in-law to go with the boys had become men. It was about as good as it gets. And there they were, waiting for the arrival of another generation. What a happy family. She was standing at the border thinking all this and remembering, and then looking west toward what was once their home and back east to what had become home, and was stunned by yet another domino fall in her memory. The cascade of trouble that had brought her back to this border. Why, it's more trouble than I have time to tell you. But you can imagine it if I just tell you that the newspaper clippings in her cigar box were all obituaries. The first obituary she remembered reading most clearly. Remembered coming down the steps from her bedroom in a fog of grief, opening up the morning paper and staring at the sentence, "He is survived by his wife, his 2 sons, their wives." It had hurt when she sold her parents' table. It had hurt when she left her home. But compared to that pain, it was not pain at all. And she thought, so this is how survival feels. The subsequent death of her 2 boys didn't hurt quite as much, because when your heart is broken, pain of another break is not the same. How did the boys die? What happened to them? I don't know. Those are the sorts of questions that spuriously interested people ask for the sake of gossip. Ooh, did you hear what happened? Does it really matter how they died? Well, knowing what happened to her boys and her husband ease the pain or bring them back? It just happened. And when we hear what happened, it makes us understand why she's standing at the border and she's bent over, as if carrying an invisible weight. Why the look on her face looks like she is punch drunk, hit too many times by life. Why her eyes are as mad as a swatted wasp stinging itself in its death throes. There she stands at the border, the dotted line on somebody's map. Behind her, there's 3 graves, and her life is buried. And ahead of her, what once was home, she knows will now be humiliation. Doubly so because there's another with her. Don't forget the other. Can you see her? Why, she's still young, and she's beautiful, and she's graceful, with youth, delightful. But here's the thing. If she steps over that line, she gives up being delightful and takes on the 5 Ds. You see? She becomes an immigrant in another land. Dirty, dangerous, dumb, destructive, devious. And with a washed up, angry with grief old mother-in-law as a ball and chain around her leg to boot. Now, knowing all of that, what could possibly lead a young girl to step across the line on somebody's map. Anybody here have an idea? You have to wonder why these desperate women didn't just toss themselves off the cliff, if you understand what they had to live for, which was really nothing except each other. So why don't they? Could it have something to do with what another man I know would say centuries later? Love your neighbor as you love yourself. You remember that the man who said that himself once crossed a line on a map as a baby in a bassinet with his mama and his daddy fleeing murder and mayhem. You remember that? You remember that baby's great, lots of great-grandfather, Jacob, once crossed a line on a map to the east, fleeing the murderous hatred of his brother, and then came back, and then, in a famine, crossed a line to the south into another country, the same line that his great-grandson, that little baby, would cross to survive. Do you remember that Jacob himself was the grandson of a man named Abram, who left home in what is now Iraq and crossed a line into what is now Syria, and then crossed another line into what is now Israel? You do remember that. So you understand that he came into the land the way all people who cross lines do, as a stranger. Now, all those stories about kin crossing lines, they made up the Bible that Jesus had in his hands when he said, love your neighbor as you love yourself. That was his Bible. One time in that Bible, it says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. But 25 times in that Bible, it says, love the stranger. Isn't that interesting? If you've ever been a stranger in a strange land, you understand why. What will happen when that old bitter woman comes home with her tail tucked between her legs, with a dirty immigrant daughter-in-law in tow? Who can imagine what might happen? I don't know. And what is the Holy Spirit of God trying to say to us by giving us this story to gather around at a time like this? I don't know. I'm wrestling with it. I know you're wrestling with it. I hope you are. It's not an easy answer, is it? It's not. And if your answer is easy, there's a very good chance it's not right. So I tell you what, let's do. Let's think about it and pray about that. And then come back next Sunday. And in the meantime, will you let me know if you hear the Holy Spirit talking to you? I mean that. I want to listen. But don't forget that we're here today with a table in front of us. So let's take all our answers and our questions that are different, and let's sit down at the table to eat together. Because you know what eating at the table is for, don't you? It's to remind us all that whatever it is that separates us is not nearly as wide as everybody wants you to believe. Really. And that all that separates us is not a drop in the bucket compared to the love that has been poured out for us. There is that promise, you know. Do not ask me to leave you or to return from following after you. For where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.